Welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to learn about using the appearance panel to create pretty complex surfaces on objects. And also, we're going to learn a lot about repetition. And it's going to be repetitive, that we're going to be learning about repetitive things and doing repetitions several times over. We will repeat things until we have done them so many times that it has become repetitive. All right, let's get started. So to start, we're just going to say File. Oops. We're going to be in the right program. We're going to say File, New. Obviously, if you're opening Photo or Illustrator right now, you would just go to this. And I'm going to suggest we do a pretty large image. I'm going to do Art and Illustration 1920 by 1080 pixels. Sorry, the web one. And the reason for that is it's just the artboard will default to being, larger in the window, right? And proportional like this. Okay, so I've created that. And so now it's time to get started. And to start with, we're going to learn about the appearance panel and about some of the options that we have in terms of the appearance of our objects. So to start with, let's just go ahead and create, let's just create a star so we have something somewhat interesting. I'm going to click and drag to start drawing that. And then you could increase it so it has a few more points or a few fewer points. Whatever works for you. I'm going to be using this many points. Then I'm going to use the selection tool. I'm going to select this thing. And I'm going to use the direct selection tool. And I'm going to go ahead and just round this out a little bit. There's no reason for this. It just, I don't know. I think it looks kind of nice that way. Okay, so I've got my object. It's sort of like not squared at all. Doesn't really matter. But so I've got my object, right? And by default, everything starts with a white fill and a black outline. And that is our appearance, right? There's the path, which is that blue highlighted line that when we go here, we have our anchor points and, right, the ability to curve these corners and the line segments between them, right? That's our path. But then the stroke and the fill are our appearance. And by default, there's just, right, we have a couple options. As we've said, right, we have our stroke, our fill, we can adjust the color of each, and we can adjust the weight of the stroke. All right, so I'm going to set my stroke to 8 points so we can kind of see what's happening with some of these next steps. And then, right, you can set your fill color to whatever you want that fill color to be, right? And we've talked before in the previous tutorial about gradients. And then we haven't really talked about patterns, but patterns are another type of fill you can use. And we will talk a bit about those potentially in this tutorial. We'll see how far we get and how much time it takes. All right, so choose a color. It can be a color, it can be a gradient. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to start with, a solid color that isn't too intense. Now, with the stroke, I think we've talked about these settings, but I just want to show you a few more options that we've got here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to use my selection tool instead of just to select the whole object. And I'm going to click on stroke here. And right, there's a few options for how things are aligned, right? We've talked a bit about this where corners can be rounded or squared or mitered. But for this object, right, with those round corners that it already has, it doesn't really matter, right? We can do a dashed line by checking dashed line. And we can, by default, the dashes are 12 pixels and then the gap is 12 pixels. If I want the gap to be smaller, right, I can say 4 pixels and then hit tab, right? And now I've got these 12 pixel dashes with a tiny little, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit, hold on, with, right, a 4 pixel gap between them. I can make this reasonably complex by adjusting these. So this is like, so now it's 12, 4, 20, and then 12, 4, etc., etc. But if I make this 4 as well, right, then I'll get something more even where there's always 4 unit spaces between these with different size dashes. And so there's options there. And when I have the dashes set, we can actually see what these caps do. So if I click this rounded cap, maybe my line thickness is too thick. Hold on, let me go ahead and make this 6 pixels instead, or 5. Oh, you know what it is? It's the, this gap is too small. Let's make this 8. Let's make this 8. There we go. Okay, so if if I want these dashes to have rounded ends, right, I'm going to click on the round cap. If I want it to have, you know, what they call a butt cap, which goes basically to the anchor point, you can imagine, right? And this this projecting cap actually pushes it a little beyond where it should be. And this is true for any stroke that you draw. It doesn't have to be dashed, right? We don't notice it here on this shape, but if I was to come in here and let's just say I create a line segment with no endings on it, right? I've just grabbed the segment tool. You can see that here's the anchor and the edge extends beyond it. If I click on stroke and I switch this to rounded, that's going to give me that rounded end. And if I click it here, it's going to just terminate right where this is. And, you know, that's up to you in terms of how that works. And then with corners, just as a rehash, because this is all part of appearance, I'm going to use my pen tool on this line segment, and I'm going to go ahead and just add a point in the middle of the line segment, and then use my direct selection tool to select that point and make a reasonably hard corner, right? Because I want to show you what happens with the, here we go, if I select this and I click on stroke again, right? If I do a rounded corner, I get that rounded corner. If I do a beveled corner, it does a bevel, right? And if I do this hard corner, it does this. And then I can, because this is just an open stroke, I can't align the stroke on the inside or outside. It's got to be aligned on the center. There's also this limit here, which right now the limit is 10. If I set the limit to 2 and hit tab, you'll notice that it chops it off, right? If I set the limit to 100, right, because this is the way it's, right, this angle is as hard as it is, it works. But if I hit the letter A and if I hit the letter A on the keyboard and I select just this point here and continue to stretch, you'll see that it's going to shoot way over. Now, one of the reasons we have this option is because sometimes there's like big overshoot that happens. And so you're like, oh, well, I want this really hard angle, but I don't want this to shoot way out past the end of there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this. I'm going to go to stroke. And sometimes, you know, if you limit it, right, my limit's set to 100 right now. If I set this to 10 and hit tab, right, it's going to chop that off. I could also always just use a rounded corner or the beveled join. Either of those things is going to help keep this from having a spike that goes off into infinity. If I make this 20 instead, that's still pretty small, 30. Right, so somewhere around 30 pixels is how far out this is shooting. All right, but those are just some additional settings that I wanted to make sure everyone knew. The other thing you can do is you can change your profile. So the profile is how the stroke goes. Is it uniform all the way across, right, the same width, or does it expand and contract, right? And so this is something that we'll talk about later, but it allows you to if I say select this, which interestingly enough doesn't let me do any adjustments to the stroke, which is fine. And it may be that this is, right? Because this is aligned on the inside or the outside, I can't do anything to my profile, but if I have it aligned on the center of the stroke, then I can adjust the profile. So I can click on this, right? And I can have this wherever this shape starts and ends is going to be the narrowest point, and wherever the middle of the stroke is here, right? Because the way Illustrator draws things is especially if you have set points like this, like so if I use my pen tool and I say 1, 2, 3 points here, right? This is the first point, the second point, and the third point. And so when it starts drawing a stroke, it's going to start here and it's going to end there. So let's go ahead and select this and take a look at that, right? So if I use this uniform, right, you can see it starts here, it gets fatter, and it ends there. And that's probably pretty hard to see with such a small thing. Here we go. All right, so it starts there, it gets bigger, it gets smaller. If I use one of these that's kind of a wedge shape, right, it's going to start really fat, and then it gets narrow. These all become very useful as we go forward, but these are just some other ways we can change that appearance. Now, obviously, we can also create or use a range of different brush strokes in order to do this, and we're not going to worry about those right now. We're just going to leave it set to basic. Okay, so I'm going to delete this shape because we don't need it. I'm going to delete this shape. Okay, so those are some of the appearance settings we can set. But we've got a lot of other appearance settings that things that we can do to this shape that we haven't really talked about, right? Like let's say that we don't just want this to be a flat blue color. We actually want this to be, right, a gradient that goes across here. Now, you know, it wouldn't be too hard to go up to our swatches and go to one of these gradients, like the sky gradient, and just use this, right? It's blue, it's a gradient, right? We're allowing color to go back and forth across, but oftentimes we want something more complex than that. We actually want a texture in here, and we want a gradient across that texture, and a solid color fill in the background, and all sorts of other things happening. So let's go ahead and get that, see if we can get that to work. I'm going to undo this last step, so I'm going to have this solid color again. And I'm going to have this object selected using the selection tool. And then over here in my panels over here, I'm going to select my appearance panel. So the appearance panel shows me what I currently have on my settings, right? It's all it is at this point is these settings up here repeated down here. Now, what's one of the differences? Well, first, with the stroke and the fill, I can set the opacity independently of one another. So if I want the opacity to be 100% on my stroke, and I may actually go ahead and select this, I'm going to change the profile to uniform just so it's more obvious all the way around. But then if I want the opacity of this to be, I don't know, 35% or something, right? So if I had, I'm going to create a second object, but not a star. Let's just do an ellipse. And I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to say arrange, send to back. And maybe I'll make this, I don't know, yellow or something. It doesn't really matter. That's kind of an ugly, muddy yellow, but that's fine. All right, so you can see that, right, this is now 35% opaque, so things are showing through. However, my stroke is 100% opaque, right? If I want the opacity of the entire thing to be adjusted, right, I have this master opacity down here, and then I could reduce the opacity of the entire object, which is going to take that 30% or whatever, 35% opacity here, and actually, you know, assume that that's 100% and then knock it down to whatever that result would be. And it's going to take the 100% opacity of the stroke and make it 27%. All right, so, and then, right, this is the master blend mode as well, right? If I want this to be multiply or screen or maybe overlay, right, I can change how the entire object blends with the objects underneath it. And then I can also change how, you know, but so I can change that. But then why would I have, you know, aside from having the opacity here, right, it also says that I can change the blend mode of these layers. So if I say multiply here, right, it's going to affect anything that it can, you know, anything that's underneath it. Right, I'm going to leave this at normal. I'm going to boost this back up to 100% for now. And apparently I left the opacity here at 90% because I can still see through this. So make that 100% too. Okay, so I have my fill and my stroke. So what's the big deal with the appearance panel? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can actually create multiple fill and multiple stroke layers. So let's start with stroke. We've got this 5-pixel black stroke, right? I'm going to select that. And then down here, there's these 3 options. We're not going to worry about effects right now. That's something we'll talk about in the future. You can experiment with it if you want to. But we're going to start with add new stroke or add new fill. So I'm going to click add new stroke. Now, when I've added this additional stroke, right, you'll see it's basically duplicated the stroke I had already selected. And so what I'm going to do, and the reason it's doing that is because that's what my settings are set to up here, right, for the tool. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this stroke, let's just make it something that'll stand off against that black and off against the white. I'm just going to go with a bright green. Right, so right now this stroke is this vibrant green and it's 5 pixels wide. So let's go ahead and boost this up to, let's just say 15 pixels. And then let's go ahead and adjust the way it's aligned. Let's go ahead and have it be aligned outside the stroke. Right, so already you can kind of see some of what's happening, right? This other stroke, you know, the black stroke that's aligned on the inside is, you know, half of that stroke width is showing, whereas all of these 15 pixels on the outside are showing. So that's, you know, one thing. The other thing I can do is I can drag these around. So if I grab this second one down and drag up, you'll see there's this blue line. And once the blue line goes above the stroke that I'm interested in, then this stroke can move on top, right? And so now I've got this shape with 2 strokes on it, which already adds a little bit of, you know, complexity and potential interest. I think my color choices and things are awful. But, you know, maybe this is actually like a darker green color, which for some reason didn't set. Oh yeah, so something to note. Note that this currently says no selection, but it still has all of the settings for this object. It is very easy in Illustrator to deselect this on accident and then start to make changes that are not going to take effect. So I need to make sure this object is selected, and then now I can go ahead and I can change the color of this to this dark green, and that should set, right? So now I've got, I just want to make sure that's right. Yep. So now I've got this darker green, the brighter green, and the blue. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So let's look at what can happen when we start to do multiple fills. So I'm going to go ahead and select the current fill. I'm going to create a new fill. You'll see that that is currently just perfectly duplicated. And so let's go ahead and let's do one of the things that is really frequently done with these multiple fills on the appearance. I'm going to go ahead and choose the black to white or the white to black gradient. And you'll see again, I switched it, but nothing happened because again, I have no selection, right? This is something I do all the time. And you will probably do it as well and be really frustrated because you're like, I'm changing values and nothing is happening. And that's because you don't actually have anything selected. It would be great, Adobe, if you were to make it so that this panel would not have any of these settings in here when you didn't have an object selected. But, you know, it's been a long, long time, and this has been the behavior of the program forever. So I don't know why you would want to change it. All right, so I've selected the white to black. All right, and so I've got this. So now it's totally overwriting the fill that's underneath it. And so there's a couple ways, you know, I can change that. First, I could change settings on the gradient so that it goes from, say, transparent to black. Or one of the things I can do is select my opacity on this fill layer. And I can come in here and I can say like multiply, right? So now I've got this gradient that's going from, you know, my original color that's underneath all the way to black. And so if I go in here and let's go ahead and I have this layer selected. If I click on my gradient tool now I can go ahead and I can modify this. So I just need to figure out where the rotation, there it is. So I can rotate this up. Now note that, right, it's going from lighter to darker, right? I can pull this down some and you can see I can make, you know, pretty substantial changes. I'm just going to scoot these edges down a little bit and pull the bottom edge up a little bit, fan this out. And then something else I can do, right, is I can adjust this stop so it's not quite so dark. I can pull this, you know, somewhere up a little bit higher so it's so that gray is a little bit lighter, right? And then also, right, I can always just pull this back here a touch so that I get, you know, a little bit more even gradation as it goes across. Okay, right, so I've got that, but, you know, that's not the end of the world. Now, something to note is I do have this appearance now here, and it's changed, and that's the appearance for the color stops, right? So if I select one of the color stops on here, I can go in here and I can reset the color, which actually that makes an interesting thing, right? To, you know, whatever I want it to be. In this case, you know, white or near white. I think this is actually bright white here. Yep. Right. So that's totally fine. So I'm going to use my selection tool. I'm going to hit the letter V on the keyboard, make sure I have this selected again. And let's go ahead and add additional fills. So I'm going to create another fill and note that one, because apparently I either had nothing selected in here or the stroke it's put it on top of everything. And it's probably hard to see this. So I'm going to go ahead and change the stroke color to something obvious like magenta. And then deselect this, but you can see that it's not showing up as magenta, and two, it's being cut off by this layer here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this down, and I'm going to select this. There we go. I'm going to select this and go ahead and pull it down here below my strokes. And for some reason, I thought I clicked on magenta, but I guess I missed. There we go. That's better. All right, so let's let's go ahead and make this 10 pixels because I want to show you this for sure, right? So this, all right, this fill, if I pull this up to the very top, right, it's going to be on top of those stroke layers. It will never exceed the bounds of the path, but it can overlay these other options. So now what I can do is I can come in here, and if I adjusted that opacity down some, you can see that the stroke is coming through, and I actually get kind of a nice, if I deselect this, I get kind of a nice effect where it's this like stepping of the darker to the pinker color. And, you know, I could even have this be brighter or lighter pink rather than green. So why don't I go ahead and adjust that, and you'll see that, right, well, maybe I'll just use this pink that's down here. But again, I forgot to select the object first, so let's go ahead and do that. And then, right, so now I've got this like kind of god-awful thing happening. But you get the idea, right, that there's, that these layers can interact with each other. Let's go ahead and add one other type of layer, and I want to show you some of the libraries that we haven't really talked about in terms of swatches. So I'm going to create another fill, but where I want this fill, I want it to end up between this gradient and this one. So I'm going to select the lowest layer, create this, and you'll see it's created a copy of that, and it's placed it essentially directly above the original. So if I come in here and I've got, you know, there's a couple patterns that I have access to. And again, I have to select the object first, do the steps over again because, you know, why would you ever want to do them the first time, right? And so now I can click on one of these patterns, and you'll see that, right, the pattern is also being impacted by all of the layers that are on top of it. And you can see that there's like a sense of depth. I'm getting, you know, a lot more visual interest just by having a couple gradients on here. And granted, this first one is just sort of graying everything out. If I turn that off, right, I'm going to get much more vibrant colors because, you know, the other gradient is set to multiply, so it keeps the saturation. It doesn't desaturate the color when it's on there. You'll notice my magenta is now just fully magenta because there's nothing overlaying it that's darkening it. All right, so, you know, I've got one, you know, but when I come in, oops. But when I go to choose a pattern here, right, I don't have many options. So if I click on my little library, swatch libraries menu here, and I go down to, there's this patterns option. And there's some that are these basic graphics, there's decorative, and then there's nature. We're going to look at some of the basic graphics and maybe some decorative really quick. But I'm going to start with dots. And while I'm here, right, it's opened up this additional menu, and you can see that if you've used other things recently, they're going to be here as well, even if it was in different files. And I'm going to go ahead and just open up a couple options here. I'm going to do dots, I'm going to do lines, and I'm going to go ahead and do textures. Right, and so so let's go ahead and switch these out. Since I have this fill layer selected, we can just sort of click through and see what these different textures look like. Right, and I want you to note all of these textures are currently right, they're black on white. But they, you know, so some of these, if I zoom in a bit, you can kind of see that there's some really interesting, you know, nice repeating textures here. And so there are a lot of defaults that we can use in Illustrator, and we'll also be looking at how we can create our own in the future. Ripple, sure, fine. So one of the things that we can do with this, right, is, again, this is set to, the opacity is set to default, it's normal and 100%, right? I can always reduce this opacity if I want this to, you know, just be more of a change to this. And I can also, use multiply as the blend mode, which should make it, right, be more blue than black when it slowly comes into fill. So I'm going to leave this somewhere in here, right? We're not doing anything super important with this. I really want you all just to be playing. If I try to overlay, that actually might work as well, right? And then I'm going to get like a more intense version of a darker version of the color that's underneath, which is really nice sometimes. Some of these other options like lighten, it's going to just disappear because, right, it's either black or white, and the black just isn't going to show up. Screen, you can see, right, I barely get anything there. And if I, but it's sort of there. And color dodge is going to bring that up a little bit more, and I'll get, right, essentially the black areas become lighter in color. Right, so there's a lot of ways that we can use this to begin to create, more complex patterns and things on our objects. Okay, and I don't know if there's a limit to how many fills you can have on this. It's probably based on your computer and what it can handle and how many objects you have in the scene. But I think it does all of this so that it's, it gives you like a preview of what's happening all the time. It's not recomputing it continually. Okay, so is there anything else we need to talk about with all of these different possibilities? Oh, we should look at, I'd say go ahead and, continue to look at different options here, right? So if I go back in here and say patterns, lines, right, now I've got lines in here. If I make this window larger, you should be able to see, all of these things. But if I do lines, you can see that there's all sorts of variations in vertical, horizontal, or vertical lines, or there's different grids as well. And then with the, let's see here. Oh, I don't have the, okay. So then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to click on patterns, and let's just go, right, dots. So if I use dots, you can again see that there are many different options in terms of what these look like and how they blend, right? And go ahead and experiment, like look through some of the other patterns that are out there. Decorative legacy. I mean, some of these are absolutely hideous. And note that there is like a base color for these, but that they change. They're going to be impacted by what other layers are on top of them and how the blend modes are set. Okay. So that's how you use the appearance panel to layer and make more complex things. We just used the linear gradient. If I select that layer and use my gradient tool, I can come up here and switch it to a radial. And so that's something that gets used quite frequently to, highlight a detail or make something, in this case, right, it almost looks like it's like we're looking into a hole, right, in the scene, because there's this, light, coming out, but everything else is dark, and it, so there's lots of ways that you can use gradients and other things and multiple fill layers to create really, pretty impressive textures on your objects in Illustrator. Okay, so on the next part of this tutorial, we are going to cover how to do repetition. And we will create an object, create some things with we'll create a couple basic fill layers that are overlaid, and then we will make some really interesting stuff.